Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Victoria Nicola. I'm an author, and today I wanted to talk about my experience and my family's experience being refugees from the Soviet Union and why that has inspired me to talk about openly the issues with communist, socialist takes and just in general the ideology of leftism and Marxism. And if you hear my story, you will understand why I have started openly criticizing anything leftist ideology based. So let's get into it. It's a little bit hard to summarize almost 100 years of persecution in a YouTube video. A little bit hard, meaning almost impossible. There are many stories that every generation faced, very like traumatic stories. A lot of them, sadly, have been lost just in history and lost because not because, oh, it's just time, but people purposely didn't speak of them in worry of being even more persecuted, or persecuted just for like remembering the traumas that happened. But let's start at the Russian Revolution. So the Russian Revolution, as some of you know, when it happened in 1917, one of the first big, like once the Reds won, one of the first things that started happening in the 20s is the dekulakization um, of rich peasants. So kulaks were considered wealthy peasants. And by wealthy, I mean if they had one cow, they were considered wealthy. It did not really mean that they were actually wealthy. It just meant that they were slightly above poverty lines. That meant that they obviously had a little bit of land where they had kept said cow. Um, and that's where all my ancestors come from. My great great grandparents were considered kulaks, and they weren't somehow taking advantage of anybody. They weren't the dreaded bourgeoisie. They were literally hardworking people who were quite literally enslaved just decades earlier because they were all within the class of serfs that were I mean, serfs are serfs. They're not exactly slaves, but essentially it was slavery. And so they were freed only in the 1860s. So within that small period of time of like about like what, 50 years, maybe 60 years, they managed to make a decent living for themselves by figuring out a way to gain land and tilling it and living off the land essentially. So all of them were persecuted heavily. Their land was seized, obviously, because that's what the Soviets did. They seized any farmland was owned by anybody because it was collectivized. It was seized and given to the state. And the people that lived there were either fled in the night, quite literally. I have many stories of great great grandparents' siblings who fled east. Many went to Siberia, and when they fled, I mean, they didn't really have a direction. They didn't know where they were going. It wasn't like, let's look at the map and this is where we can go. No, they just needed to get away from the towns and cities where the Bolshevik grasp was the strongest. And so they quite literally fled as far as they could. Many of them ended up in Uzbekistan, and that's where my dad was born, and even my brother, they were born in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. So, many fled, like I said. Some were actually arrested and exiled to Siberia. Like I have a great great grandfather who was exiled to Siberia for 10 years. And when I say exiled, it wasn't like they dropped you off at an outpost that existed in Siberia, like right, like prison or a labor camp. They literally loaded trains of these exiled peasants, drove like drove these trains into the wilderness of Siberia and dropped them off and left. And if people survived, somehow they survived. And if mostly the intention was to like kill them without having to lift a finger. You know what I'm saying? So he was exiled and he managed to survive and he came back. came back to Samato, which is where my mom is from. Um, so yeah, that was kind of like the beginning. Didn't bode well for my family. On top of the Kulak persecution, what ended up happening was, as many of you know, the Soviet Union was a declared atheist state. In general, all communists are really atheists, um, unless somehow they're like playing mental gymnastics, because Marxism essentially is an atheist ideology. Um, the whole like religion is opium for the masses is like a leftist concept, and they Marx wanted to eliminate religion because his whole theory was that once you eliminate religion, or once you implement his amazing utopic collectivist ideas, you don't even need religion because it can be so beautiful. As we know, so beautiful isn't exactly the word that you would use to describe anything that happened in Marxist, socialist, and communist dystopias. Um, but what happened was a lot of my ancestors, they were either Orthodox, well, they were all Orthodox. Well, no, not all. Some of them were Orthodox, some of them were I guess a religion or a branch of religion of Christianity called Malakani, who left Orthodoxy and kind of formed their own. It was like a very decentralized version of a reformation within the Russian Empire that started in like the 1600s. So some of my ancestors were Malakan, some of them were Orthodox. All of them converted to evangelical Baptists around the turn of the century. So they were all evangelical Baptists at the point of the Russian Revolution. And if you read Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, there's like a very noteworthy honorary mention of the persecution that any Protestants faced. There was just like an ongoing, like, whereas with Orthodoxy, like Orthodox priests or any other religions, really there happened to be like waves of persecution. But with the Baptist or any Protestant branch of Christianity, they were just nonstop hounded and persecuted. They were nonstop hauled off into prison, tortured, um, killed, sent off to gulags. Um, I know I have so many stories of great grandparents and also the great grandparents of friends who had very traumatic prison stories. One of my childhood best friends, her grandfather was eventually he died in prison, but he spent 30 years on and off in prison. So not consecutively. They would like give him 10 years, then he'd come out, then they would arrest him and send him to prison again. And he eventually died imprisoned. My great grandfather on my mother's side died in prison during World War II, while his four sons were fighting on the front. Um, so obviously loyalty and participation in World War II did not mean much to the communists. If they had it were against you because of your religion, no matter what else you did, it was just not considered good enough. You were still considered an enemy of the state. And by the way, when I talk about this on social media, on TikTok specifically, oftentimes I get pushback saying, where is the actual law that states religion was prohibited in the Soviet Union? They didn't need to have a law that prohibited religion in the Soviet Union. They had a Statute 58, Статья 58, which basically stood for counter-revolutionary, it was illegal to have any counter-revolutionary activities, and religion was considered counter-revolutionary. I mean, really anything could be considered counter-revolutionary that they didn't like, that the state didn't like. So religion fell under that. So my great-grandfather was imprisoned, uh, by being a counter-revolutionary. That was like their justification. And my grandfather, who fought in World War II, who became a commander of tanks at 17, dedicated his entire youth to fighting. He was in a tank explosion 3 times, barely survived, had shrapnel covering his body all over. Passed away fairly young because of just like how beat up his body was. He was considered a son of enemy of the state. So not only did it didn't stop at the my great grandfather, it like the kids inherited the title, being children of an enemy of the state. And that unfortunately disqualified them from many privileges what the Soviet Union offered, like for being a World War II vet and that sort of thing. So even though as the Soviet Union progressed, especially after the passing of Stalin, they did release the reins on persecution, especially of religious people. Um, they did begin to kind of like relax with that persecution. However, it's still there was these other things that they would find ways to undermine you, right? Because if you're a child or a grandchild of an enemy of the state, then you wouldn't get certain privileges at school. You would be barred from maybe going to a certain to like pretty much most universities, that kind of thing, you know? So um, that was that generation. And then my grandparents, so my dad's dad, my grandfather, he actually was imprisoned in the 60s. And to the point, and he was in prison at the same time as my great grandfather from my dad's side. So they both were in prison around the same time for also counter-revolutionary activities. And their counter-revolutionary activity was like preaching, preaching. So they ended up in prison, and I think they went in for a much longer sentence than they ended up getting because at the time when Stalin died, the state released a bunch of prisoners uh, as like a policy. I think that was really just their way of like kind of loosening the reins so that like the people kind of didn't counter revolt against the state because it was so repressive and so intense. Um, so a lot of people were rehabilitated criminals, criminals, for preaching. But you know, I mean, I know people who were thrown into prison for like selling socks. Like a friend's, the grandfather of one of my friends was in Ukraine, was thrown into prison for selling socks, to survive. Yeah. So, it got really, it was really dark. It was a very dark experience for my family. And my so my grandfather, my dad's dad, when he went to prison, my grandma already had 5 kids. He told my grandma, if you have a way to leave the Soviet Union to escape, go. Go without me, even with 5 kids. I will find a way to find you. I will eventually leave here and I will find you. So that's the level of desperation they were functioning with. And so even in the 60s, my family was already looking for a way to escape. Unfortunately, they didn't really get that opportunity until the late 80s, early 90s. Actually, late 80s was when it started to like become a real possibility because the Soviet Union was really losing power. And so it was beginning to be a lot more feasible to actually leave. Um, my entire family was able to leave in those early 90s, 90, 91. And yeah, and we escaped. And the dream was always to come to America because it's considered the land of the free. They dreamt about like having freedom of religion. And so imagine my shock. Now that we're here, like we were always very grateful. My dad always had like an American flag. And in the last like decade, a little over a decade, we've been noticing this trend of like socialism becoming a trend, becoming like the college educated preferred version of ideology. And we're kind of like looking around going, what is going on? We fled this. We thought people knew how disastrous the policies were. And meanwhile, people are beginning to get brainwashed and sucked in to begin to kind of like try to implement these ideologies. Um, so it's very actually harrowing for people who are Soviet refugees to see this kind of thing begin to take place in the very country that we found refuge in. So that is why I am beginning to speak out. And this is very, very, very popular actually within like traditional publishing. There are a lot of far leftists, even like not just like far left, like as like a fun, edgy title that you can name yourself. No, like there are legitimate communists. I've even seen the word Leninist in certain authors' bios on like whatever social media platforms. And it's become incredibly popular to be a Marxist, socialist, communist on these social media platforms within the writing space. And it is incredibly unnerving. It is unnerving because these are people who have access to education, right? If you're a writer, if you're a reader, you have access to your, literate. You have access to history books. You have access to libraries where you can go and research how did socialism, Marxism, communism play out in real life. It's not just about theory. Anything can sound nice on theory. You can make a Tsarist regime sound nice on theory. Um, so sorry, in theory. So theory is different from reality. And I think this is where people get lost because people are so hyper focused on ideas of like Marxism, like the ideology itself, on what it would look like in theory, in their head, that they forget like we have 100 years worth of data of like how communism, leftism actually played out in real life, not just in the Soviet Union, right? But like pretty much on almost every continent, in South America, in Africa, in Asia, in Eastern Europe, there were communist countries. Take your pick of which ethnicity, which nationality you want to follow. See how communism played out. Um, so it's incredibly frustrating, to say the least, as somebody who's in the writing world as an author, to see these kind of things begin to take place and become very popular. It's incredibly frustrating because you would think these are the people that should have the knowledge at their fingertips, at their typing little fingertips. They could look it up and somehow still ignore history and reality. So this is why I'm beginning to talk about it more openly. I know it's a little controversial. I know people don't like political takes in the book space. I don't like it either. I don't like that. Um, I feel like I need to speak out, but I think my experience and my family's experience is incredibly important. I feel like I'm like guarding a very important secret for the sake of keeping peace, but that peace isn't kept anyways because I already got canceled. So, um, I'm gonna start sharing my takes on socialism, communism, and why I think they're bad ideas, and giving solid examples of what happened in the Soviet Union and my family's experience. So if you guys think this is interesting, if you guys want to follow along, please subscribe to my channel, and I'll hope to see you in my future videos. Have a good day.